What moment at the World Cup made you realize that football is more than just a game? My grandfather watched England win the World Cup in 1966. Every tournament after that we watched together and shared one order of fish and chips because he insisted that changing the routine would bring bad luck. Before every opening match, he would say that he only wanted to see England win it one more time, this time with me beside him. He died several years ago. I still buy the same meal whenever England play. If they ever lift the trophy again, I know I will not be thinking about the players for stars. I will be thinking about the empty chair beside me, and the man who taught me why the tournament mattered. I was 8 during the 1998 World Cup. When David Beckham was sent off against Argentina, I did not fully understand the rules. But I understood that every adult in the house had suddenly stopped breathing. England lost on penalties. I locked myself in my mother's bathroom and cried on the floor because it was the only room where nobody could see me. The next morning, my father found me practicing penalties against the garage door. He stood in goal before going to work and let me score the winning shot over and over again. That was the first time I understood that football could break your heart at night and still make you hopeful the next morning. The 1994 World Cup was the first football match I had ever seen on television. Our youth coach had never played the sport. He even taught us to restart the game in a formation that looked more like American football. Then we watched Brazil, Italy, the Netherlands, and Romania. Everything was faster and more graceful than the game we thought we knew. At our next practice, nobody listened to the coach. We were all trying moves we'd seen on television. We failed badly, but something had changed. A month earlier, football had just been an activity our parents signed us up for. After that summer, it became the thing we talked about every day. When North America was announced as the host, my son was still a baby. I remember holding him and thinking that by the time the tournament arrived, he would be old enough to remember our first match together. Years later, I finally bought the tickets. Then the schedule came out. We live in Canada, but our national team was playing in Mexico, almost as far from us as possible. For a moment, I thought about selling them. Instead, we turned the trip into an adventure. My son made a map, learned the names of every city, and started saving his allowance for souvenirs. We had not even left home, and the World Cup had already given us a story we would tell for years. I attended a match where Mexico were eliminated. I expected to walk out of the stadium to feel miserable. People had traveled thousands of miles, spent money they probably should not have spent, and watched their team lose. Then, somebody started playing music. Within minutes, Mexican supporters were dancing with fans of the team that had beaten them. Strangers traded scarves, took photographs together, and shared food in the parking lot. One man saw me staring and said, "We lost a football match." We did not lose the party. That sentence stayed with me. The result mattered deeply to everyone there, but they refused to let 90 bad minutes ruin the reason they had come together. I was in the stadium when Neymar was injured against Colombia in 2014. At first, it looked like another hard challenge. Then the stretcher came out, and the mood changed. Brazilian supporters around me were checking their phones, trying to learn whether he would play again. A few days later, Brazil faced Germany without him. The first goal hurt. The second caused panic. By the fourth, nobody around me was shouting anymore. People simply stared at the screen as if the scoreboard had to be wrong. What I remember most is not the 7 goals. It is a father covering his young son's eyes while the boy kept asking why everyone was crying. I had never seen an entire country experience the same nightmare at once. In 1990, the United States lost to Italy by a single goal. Today, that sounds like an ordinary defeat. At the time, it felt almost like a victory. International football was difficult to watch where I lived. One of the parents on our youth team rented a huge satellite dish so we could see the match. About 30 people crowded into a small living room, and half of us sat on the floor. When the final whistle blew, the adults applauded because the American team had survived against one of the best sides in the world. I remember thinking that losing was supposed to feel bad. That day taught me that sometimes the score does not explain what a match means to the people watching it. Every 4 years, I promise myself that I will not care so much this time. I tell my family that I am older, calmer, and no longer willing to let 11 strangers ruin my week. Then my country wins the first group match. I start studying the bracket. After the second win, I calculate possible opponents and convince myself that the path to the final is completely realistic. Eventually, we lose in the most painful way available. I turn off the television and announce that I am finished forever. 4 years later, the World Cup sends the emotional equivalent of a midnight message asking, "Are you awake?" I always answer. That is when I realize supporting a national team is less like a hobby and more like a recurring family problem. My father and I barely spoke when I was a teenager. We could turn a 5-minute conversation about school into an argument, so eventually we stopped trying. During the 2002 World Cup, matches started early in the morning where we lived. One day, I came downstairs and found him making coffee before Brazil played. I sat down without saying anything. For the rest of the tournament, we watched every morning match together. We discussed formations, terrible refereeing, and which player had the worst haircut. We still avoided every serious subject, but for 2 hours each day, being in the same room felt easy again. We did eventually repair our relationship. Football did not solve everything, but it gave us a safe place to begin talking. I worked the night shift during the 2010 World Cup. My manager banned televisions because he thought the matches would destroy productivity. Someone concealed a small radio behind a stack of boxes. Whenever a goal was scored, the person closest to it would cough loudly, and the news traveled across the warehouse through a chain of increasingly ridiculous coughs. During one match, our manager walked onto the floor just as our country scored. Every employee suddenly started coughing at once. He looked around, sighed, and said, "Fine. Put the radio on the table." For the rest of the tournament, he listened with us. Years later, I cannot remember what we were packing in that warehouse, but I remember exactly where everyone stood for that goal. My parents immigrated when I was young. At home, we spoke their language, ate their food, and supported their national team. At school, I tried hard to sound like everybody else, and rarely mentioned where we came from. During the World Cup, our team unexpectedly reached the knockout stage. The next morning, I arrived at school and found classmates wearing our colors. Kids who had never asked about my country wanted to know the songs, the players, and how to pronounce the names correctly. For the first time, I was not embarrassed to be different. I was the person everyone came to for information. That tournament lasted only a few weeks, but it changed the way I spoke about my family for the rest of my life. I traveled to a World Cup match alone after the friend who was supposed to join me became sick. My seat was between supporters from 2 different countries, and I worried that I would spend the entire game feeling out of place. Before kickoff, the family on my left offered me food. The group on my right taught me the words to their chant. Neither side spoke much English, and I spoke none of their languages, so most of our communication involved gestures and terrible singing. When the match ended in a draw, both groups insisted that I join their photograph. Somewhere, 2 families on opposite sides of the world have the same picture of a confused stranger standing between them. I have it framed in my hallway. My grandmother knew nothing about football, but she watched the 2018 World Cup because the rest of the family took over her living room. At first, she asked why players were allowed to pass backward and why the goalkeeper wore a different shirt. By the semifinal, she had opinions about substitutions and complained that one defender was standing too high. Our team lost and everyone sat in silence. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with cake. Then she said, "You are all acting as if they canceled the country. Eat something." She died before the next tournament. Now, whenever our team is eliminated, somebody in the family brings out a cake. It is a strange tradition, but grief and football have strange rules. I missed the winning goal because I was helping a stranger. We were watching on a giant outdoor screen when an older man beside me became dizzy and fell. A few of us carried him away from the crowd and found a medic. While we were gone, the entire square exploded with noise. I was disappointed until the man opened his eyes and asked whether we had scored. When I told him yes, he smiled and said, "Then you have to describe it to me." So I invented the most dramatic version possible, with a perfect pass and an unstoppable shot. Later, I watched the replay and discovered the real goal was messy and deflected. I still prefer the version I told him. During a penalty shootout, my 5-year-old daughter asked why the goalkeeper looked so lonely. I explained that everyone would either celebrate the player who scored or blame the goalkeeper who failed to stop him. She thought about that for a moment, walked up to the television and said, "I am supporting the goalkeeper then. He saved the next penalty." She screamed louder than anyone in the room and spent the rest of the tournament pretending to dive across the sofa. She is a teenager now and plays goalkeeper for her school. Whenever people ask why she chose the position nobody else wanted, she says it started because one man on television looked like he needed somebody on his side. The most important World Cup match of my life ended 0-0. I watched it in a hospital room while waiting for surgery. The patient in the next bed supported the opposing team. We were both frightened, but neither of us wanted to admit it, so we spent 2 hours arguing about every decision instead. When the match ended, he reached across the space between our beds and said a draw was fair. The nurses took me away a few minutes later. The surgery went well. Before I left the hospital, I found out he had also recovered. We traded phone numbers and still message each other whenever our countries play. That boring, scoreless match gave 2 scared strangers something normal to hold on to.